In October of 1933, on a ranch 11 miles northwest of the town of Llano, Texas, a water well driller named Walter Kessler brought his rig to a stop at a depth of 90 feet and refused to go any further until someone official had come out to see what the bit had struck. The ranch belonged to a man named Otto Behrens, whose cattle had gone 3 seasons without a reliable well and who had scraped together enough drought relief money to pay for the drilling himself. The whole of central Texas was dry that year. Stock tanks had cracked open like old plates. Ranchers who had never asked the county for anything were standing in line at the relief office in Llano, and Behrens was one of them, hoping a hand-me-down loan and a driller willing to work cheap could get water out of ground that had not seen real rain since the spring before last. Kessler had sunk wells across Llano County for 11 years. He knew the ground, pink granite near the surface, then decomposed rock, then the older Precambrian formations that gave the whole region its name, the Llano Uplift, one of the oldest exposed rock bodies on the continent. He did not expect what came up in the baler that afternoon, not gravel, not the grey marl that usually meant water was close, white dust, fine as flour, and underneath it, when he pulled the bit for inspection, a smear of polish on the steel that a driller does not get from breaking rock. He got it from grinding against something that had already been finished. Kessler shut the engine down, sat on the running board of his own truck for the better part of an hour, and by his own later account to Behrens, decided he was not touching that hole again without a witness. He rode into Llano the next morning to find the county agent. He carried with him a burlap sack half full of the white dust and 3 chips of stone the size of a thumbnail, hard and cold, taking a polish when he rubbed them against his palm. The county agent, a man named Roy Fenner, had spent 15 years processing drought claims and knew nothing about geology, but he knew what marble looked like because Llano County had been shipping marble and pink granite out by rail since the 1880s, some of it bound for the state capitol building in Austin. What Fenner could not explain was the depth and the flatness. Quarried marble comes out of the ground in blocks, cut along whatever seam the rock provides. What Kessler described, and what the chips in the sack seemed to confirm, was not a seam waiting to be cut. It was a surface. Level, by Kessler's own driller's plumb, across the width of the borehole, at a depth well beneath anything the local quarrymen had ever touched. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Fenner rode out to the Behrens place that same afternoon. What he found was a 6-inch borehole plugged with drilling mud, a driller who would not touch the rig again until a geologist looked at it, and a rancher standing at the fence line asking whether any of this meant he would ever get his water. Fenner had the presence of mind to do one thing right. He had Kessler bail the hole clean and lower a weighted line to the bottom, and he wrote the reading down himself, in the small ledger he carried for relief claims, 90 feet, 4 inches. Then he asked Kessler to drop the bit one more time, gently, and turn it by hand rather than by engine, so the two of them could feel what it met rather than grind through it blind. What came back up were 3 more chips, larger than the first, one of them with a shallow groove cut into its face, straight for its full length, the kind of mark a chisel leaves and a fracture never does. Fenner bagged everything separately, labeled the sacks in pencil, and sent word to the geology department at the University of Texas in Austin, 100 miles to the southeast, asking for someone to come look at what a well driller had found under a cattle ranch in the middle of a drought. A second well told them the first was not a fluke. Behrens, against his own better judgment and mostly because Fenner asked him to, allowed Kessler to sink a test hole 40 feet to the east of the first, hoping either to miss whatever was down there or to confirm it one way or the other. The second bit struck the same white dust at 89 feet, not 90. 89, a difference of 12 inches over 40 feet of lateral distance, which by itself is close enough to level that a survey crew would have called the ground flat. 2 boreholes do not make a floor. But 2 boreholes agreeing on a depth to within a foot, 40 feet apart, in country where the natural rock pitches and buckles the way the Llano Uplift does, is not something the granite quarrymen who gathered at the fence line could wave off as coincidence. Several of them had worked the Marble Falls quarries downriver for 20 years apiece. None of them had ever seen a natural deposit lie that flat, that consistently, without a visible seam breaking the surface somewhere for a man to follow it by eye. Word of the strike travelled through Llano faster than Fenner could control it. Within 2 days there were a dozen cars parked along the fence line of a ranch that, 3 weeks earlier, no one outside the immediate family had any reason to visit. The county surveyor, a man named Otto Lindig, who had run transit lines for the highway department for a decade, brought his own instrument out on his own time, unasked, and set it up over both boreholes to check what a driller's plumb line could only estimate. His transit readings, recorded in a private notebook rather than any official county document, agree with Kessler's own figures to within an inch. 2 points, 40 feet apart, level to within an inch, on a formation that rises and falls in visible folds everywhere else on the property. Lindig never filed his own findings anywhere. He mentioned them, according to his son's later recollection, only to a handful of people at the feed store, and then stopped mentioning them at all. What came up from those 2 boreholes was examined informally, by hand, before anyone with a university degree arrived. A stonecutter named Frank Ostrander, who had cut marble for courthouse steps in 3 counties over a working life of nearly 30 years, looked over the largest chip under a hand lens borrowed from the county surveyor's office. He said the stone was true marble, not the pink granite the region was known for in the trade catalogues, closer in grain and hardness to the white stone quarried near Marble Falls and shipped out under names like Cold Spring or Texas Cream depending on the buyer. What troubled Ostrander was not the type of stone. It was the polish. Quarried marble, even freshly cut and finished, carries the faint scratch pattern left by the saw, visible under a lens if not to the naked eye. What he was looking at had no scratch pattern at all, only a smoothness he associated with stone worn by decades of contact rather than cut by a single pass of a blade, the kind of finish he had only ever seen on a church threshold or a courthouse step polished by 40 years of shoes. He put that observation in writing, on a half sheet of paper, unsigned, and left it with Fenner before returning to his shop. That note survives among the Fenner family papers today. It is the only first-hand professional assessment of the material made by someone who had spent a career working stone by hand, and in Ostrander's own words on the page, the surface looked walked on. Word reached the Behrens ranch that a geologist was on his way from Austin before Fenner's letter had even been formally answered, because a colleague of the intended recipient had heard about the borehole second-hand and mentioned it at a faculty dinner. The University of Texas sent a young structural geologist named Carl Whitfield, who had joined the faculty 2 years earlier after finishing a doctoral dissertation on the igneous and metamorphic formations of the Llano Uplift, the same rock body sitting under Behrens's pasture. Whitfield arrived on the 2nd of November 1933, driving his own car the 100 miles from Austin because the university would not authorize travel funds for a claim that had not yet been verified by anyone on staff. He examined both boreholes, took his own core sample from the second hole using a diamond coring bit he had brought with him, and stayed on the property for 4 days, sleeping in a spare room at the Behrens house and working the rig himself alongside Kessler each morning. Whitfield's field notebook, portions of which survived in a private collection and were never formally filed with the university, describes the core sample in careful, almost reluctant language, the language of a man writing something down because his training requires it and not because he is comfortable with the conclusion it points toward. He records the depth, the mineral composition, the density, the absence of any natural bedding plane above or below the marble layer that would explain, by any process he had studied, how a sheet of finished stone came to lie flat under 90 feet of granite and decomposed rock, with no transitional layer between them. He records, on his 3rd day at the site, that he extended the second borehole with the narrow diamond bit and recovered a fragment showing what he called, in his own handwriting, a right-angle edge, cut clean at a depth of 91 feet. A right angle is not something the Llano Uplift produces on its own. Marble in that formation lies in folded sheets and lenses, shaped over hundreds of millions of years by heat and pressure. It does not fold itself into 90-degree corners, and no geological process known to Whitfield's own field of study does either. Whitfield photographed the fragment before he packed it, using a plate camera he had also brought from the university, propping the piece against a fence post in direct sun to catch the edge in shadow. Two of those photographic plates survive with the notebook. Both show the same object from slightly different angles, a pale, corner-shaped fragment resting against weathered fence wood, the kind of image that on its own could be dismissed as an ordinary broken rock photographed at a flattering angle. What keeps the photographs from being dismissed outright is Whitfield's own measurement, written beneath the second plate in pencil, the angle checked with a machinist's square at 89 degrees. Within the margin, any hand tool of the period would allow for a true right angle. He was not a man inclined toward theatrics. His notebook elsewhere is full of ordinary field observations about granite weathering and drainage patterns, written in the flat, unremarkable tone of a working scientist. The entry about the fragment reads no differently in style. It simply describes something his training told him should not exist at that depth, in that rock, and offers no explanation for it at all. Whitfield left the Behrens ranch on the 6th of November with his samples, his notebook, and a promise to Fenner that he would file a full geological report with the county once the university laboratory in Austin had finished analyzing what he had brought back. He kept part of that promise. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. A report was filed. The Llano County Clerk's Office recorded its arrival on the 18th of November 1933 in the incoming correspondence ledger in an entry that still exists today and can be read in the clerk's own handwriting. Received, University of Texas, Geological Survey, Behrens Well Site, filed to Record Book 4. Record Book 4 does not contain it. The page numbers in Record Book 4 run in unbroken sequence from January of that year through early December, except for a gap of 6 pages between entries dated the 14th and the 22nd of November, pages that were never numbered, never filled, and, according to the binding itself, never removed either, because there is no tear, no stub, no evidence the pages were cut out after the fact. They were left blank at the time the book was bound and simply never used. Something arrived and was logged as received on the 18th. Nothing was ever recorded in the space set aside to hold it. What happened to Whitfield himself is easier to trace than what happened to his report. He returned to the university, finished the fall semester, and by the following spring had accepted a position with an oil survey company operating in the Permian Basin of West Texas. A common enough career move during the Depression, when private industry paid promptly and university salaries sometimes did not arrive at all. What is less common is that Whitfield never again published a single paper on the geology of the Llano Uplift, the subject of his own doctoral dissertation and the formation that had made his early academic reputation for the remaining 31 years of his working life. Colleagues who wrote about him after his death in 1964 described a careful, unspectacular field geologist who moved into industry work and stayed there without complaint. None of the obituaries mention the Behrens well. None of the colleagues who wrote them appear to have known it existed. A man who had built his early career on one formation walked away from that formation entirely within a year of examining a right-angle marble edge at 91 feet beneath a Texas cattle ranch, and never explained why, in writing, to anyone who left a record of it. The Behrens well was plugged that winter. Whether Otto Behrens plugged it himself out of frustration at never getting water, or whether someone advised him to close it, is not recorded anywhere that has surfaced. What is recorded is a receipt, kept among the Behrens family papers now held by a great-granddaughter in Fredericksburg, showing payment to a local crew for hole abandonment and backfill, dated the 9th of December 1933, almost exactly 1 month after Whitfield's report went missing from the county record book. The rancher who had waited 3 drought years for water sealed the only 2 holes on his property that had ever found anything at all, and drilled a 3rd well, successfully, 400 yards to the north, where he struck ordinary groundwater at 31 feet, and according to his own children in interviews recorded decades later, never spoke of the marble again in any conversation they could remember. The Behrens site is not the only place in the Llano Uplift where a driller's bit met a floor instead of a deposit. In 1936, 3 years later, and 22 miles to the west near the town of Mason, a rancher named Herman Klein hired a crew to deepen an existing stock well and struck what his own foreman described, in a letter written to a cousin in San Antonio, as a solid rock shelf at 87 feet, hard enough that the bit would not advance for 2 full days, no matter how the crew adjusted the weight or the rotation speed. The Mason County well never drew the kind of attention the Behrens well had drawn 3 years earlier. No university geologist was called out to examine it. The crew simply moved the rig 40 feet to one side, sank a fresh hole, and found ordinary water at 50 feet, leaving the original borehole capped, and the shelf beneath it unexamined by anyone with the training to identify what it actually was. The foreman's letter describing the discovery sat folded inside a family Bible for close to 60 years before a local historian transcribed portions of it in the 1990s, publishing the transcription in a small regional history newsletter without ever connecting it to what had happened at the Behrens Ranch, because by then almost no one in Mason County had heard that story either. The second comparable find came in 1941, at a quarry expansion outside Marble Falls itself, 40 miles downriver from Llano, along the same exposed formation. Quarry workers cutting a new bench into the hillside broke through into what the foreman's daily production log calls a cavity, roughly the size of a small room, its floor and one wall finished smooth in the same white stone the quarry had been cutting and shipping commercially for 60 years. The log entry, preserved among the quarry company's surviving business records, notes the discovery in a single terse line, notes that the company superintendent was called out to examine it personally that same afternoon, and then simply stops. The next entry, 4 days later, records ordinary production tonnage with no further mention of the cavity, the finished wall, or what became of either one. According to the production schedule for that week, the bench was blasted forward on schedule, and whatever the crew had opened into was buried again under fresh quarry rubble before anyone outside the company had the chance to see it for themselves. 3 sites, spread across 3 separate decades, along the same narrow band of exposed Precambrian rock running through Llano and Burnett and Mason counties. 3 times a crew, working for wages, not for discovery, opened into a finished surface that the natural geology of the region does not, by any process currently understood, produce on its own. 3 times the response afterward was the same. Seal it, move the rig, and let the paperwork go quiet, without anyone ever raising their voice about it. No county official, in any of the 3 counties, ever formally connected the sites to one another. No geologist ever cross-referenced Whitfield's missing report against Herman Klein's foreman's letter, or the Marble Falls production log, because the 3 records sat for decades in 3 separate private collections, uncatalogued and unsearchable, until long after everyone directly involved in any of them was dead. What survives, physically, is smaller than what was lost. 3 of Kessler's original chips from the first Behrens borehole remained in Roy Fenner's family after his death in 1958, kept as a curiosity in a cigar box alongside his old drought relief paperwork, the same box that still holds Frank Ostrander's unsigned note. His granddaughter has them today. One chip still shows the shallow chiseled groove Fenner recorded in his own field description back in 1933. It has been examined twice by amateur collectors in recent years, informally, and never by a professional geological laboratory, because no institution has ever formally requested access to it. Carl Whitfield's field notebook, the one containing his own description of the right-angle edge at 91 feet, surfaced at an estate sale in Austin in 2003, purchased by a private collector of Texas geological history who has allowed limited access to independent researchers, but has never donated the notebook to a university archive where it might be catalogued and studied properly. The core sample Whitfield extracted from the second borehole, the one his own notes describe carrying back to Austin for laboratory analysis, has not been located at all. It does not appear in any University of Texas collection inventory from the period, and the geology department has no institutional record of ever receiving it, despite Whitfield's own field notebook stating plainly, in his own hand, that he intended to bring it back for exactly that purpose. What this leaves behind is not a case that can be closed in either direction, and it does not pretend otherwise. It is a driller's plumb-line reading of 90 feet, agreed within a single foot across two separate boreholes 40 feet apart, in rock that does not naturally hold that kind of tolerance across any distance. It is a working stonecutter's unsigned note, in his own hand, describing a surface that looked walked on. It is a young geologist who found a clean right angle in Precambrian marble and never published on the formation that made his early reputation for the remaining 31 years of his career. It is 6 blank pages, bound into a county ledger and never filled, sitting exactly where a geological survey report was logged as received and then simply was not. None of these things, taken by itself, proves that something built by hands lies beneath the cattle country north of Llano, Texas. Taken together, they describe the outline of an argument that no one in more than 90 years has been willing to finish making in either direction on the public record. Walter Kessler kept drilling wells in Llano County for another 19 years after the Behrens job, retiring in 1952 and living another decade after that in a small house on the edge of town. According to his daughter, interviewed by the same local historian who later transcribed the Klein letter from Mason County, her father would not discuss the Behrens well at length, but he never once denied that it happened, and he kept, until his death, a single unlabeled chip of white stone on the windowsill above his kitchen sink, distinct from the pieces Fenner had bagged and kept himself. Where that particular chip came from, whether from the first borehole or the second, Kessler never said, and his daughter never thought to ask while he was alive to answer. Otto Behrens's third well still stands on what remains of the family ranch, capped and dry now for decades, the property having passed through 2 more owners since his death in 1962. The original borehole, the one Kessler drilled in October of 1933, was never reopened by anyone. Its exact location is marked today only by a slight depression in the pasture grass, low enough and old enough that any rancher walking that ground would pass it without a second look, unless he already knew what one man found 90 feet beneath it in the last dry autumn of 1933, and what happened, within the same season, to the only official report that ever tried to explain it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.